Hello, and welcome to Integrated Rhythm. On today's episode, you'll be hearing from SHANI Brown. SHANI Brown is an award-winning international swing dance instructor, judge, dancer. Her unique history includes close mentorship from elders within the Southern California swing dance community. A person of particular note for her is Willie Desitoff. He's one of the old timers revered in Balboa. Along with her over 20 years of dancing history, she has an educational background that includes women's studies and also studying biomechanical movement. She brings all of these pieces into her teaching and into her understanding of social issues within the swing scene. SHANI is a treasure trove of information. We appreciate SHANI Brown. Thank you so much for tuning in. Here at Integrated Rhythm, we wanted to take a moment and pause and reflect on the events of yesterday. Today is January 7th, 2021, and yesterday, a group of extremists stormed the Capitol. That in and of itself is traumatizing. We wanted to be mindful of our listeners who are coming from a variety of backgrounds, recognizing that each and every one of you might be experiencing the effects of trauma. What does this mean for our world today that thousands of people stormed Capitol Hill and disrupted Congress? I know from my perspective, a perspective of marginalized identities, being a Black woman in the United States, yesterday was terrifying because the people who stormed the Capitol were carrying Confederate flags, hung up a cross and then put a noose around it, engaged in activities that are reflective of extremist ideologies. And they did so in a way that demonstrated a kind of audacity that I know another marginalized group may not have been able to get away with. Let's substitute the word extremists and put in Black people. Let's take out the word extremists and put in Muslims. Let's take out the word extremists and put in Latinx people. And what do you think the result would be? I can tell you the result because there was a woman who was found to be mentally unstable. And some years ago, she stormed the gates of the Capitol in a moment of delusion with her baby in her car. And she met a fatal end. That woman looked like me. So recognizing that privilege is unearned social power that is often invisible to those who have it. It was very clear that the events of yesterday, had they been perpetrated by pretty much any other group that was from a minoritized or marginalized perspective, would have led to far more fatalities, far more injured. If the summer was any indication, we know what would have happened. And so those of us from marginalized identities are probably processing that or resigned in that. I cannot speak for everyone, but I know that I am. And it's hard. So we at Integrated Rhythm wanted to take a moment and acknowledge that. We wanted to name the atrocity. So that we're thinking of you, our hearts are with you. Thank you so much for joining us and listening to our wonderful episode about Miss Shani Brown, an incredible individual with wonderful things to say.
Awesome. So, Shani, I would love to hear a little bit about how you got started in swing dancing. And those of us who know you, who know a little bit about your story, have an understanding that you have a mantle to carry. And so it's this really interesting, you have this really interesting relationship with swing dances. So, could you tell us a little bit about yourself in this dance?
Yeah, so I should actually go back a little further than I usually do with the story, and that's when I started dancing in San Diego. I did mention it recently that I actually started swing dancing because I was going out to punk and ska clubs all the time, and from the time I was like in junior high or elementary school. And there's like an all ages club right next to my house and my gymnastics center. And there were swing dancers there, and I was like, "That's cool." So I started to, and like the fad was out, like Gap commercial had been out. It was just sort of a thing that was becoming a national phenomena again. Um, and I started taking some swing classes, and Peter Loggins had come down to San Diego to teach a series of classes over a weekend. And I got hooked into like my first weekend event, sort of a thing that, here in San Diego. And I got into colleges, and I chose to go to UC Irvine because I could be near the scene that I knew I was starting to like drive up to Orange County and want to go dancing at Memories and see what the sort of like dance thing was about. And I also quit gymnastics, so I'd had a knee injury, and dancing was weirdly less stressful on my knee than gymnastics was, obviously. Most people are like, it's terrible on your knees, and I'm like, this is amazing, this is so much easier. um, yeah, it was so much lighter on my knees, and it was specifically the sort of smoother styles of swing dancing that Orange County was doing that was so much like, I was like, when I think about the physics of movement, and this is all coming from my gymnastics training, I'm like, this is great, I can do this for a long time because it's not like impacting me. And they were starting to talk about stuff like that. Anyway, so I went to Orange County, and my first week at school, you have like orientation week before you actually start university. And we were rushing fraternities and sororities, and I happened to walk into the fraternity house next door, and there was this guy giving a lesson on swing outs to this other fraternity member. That fraternity member weirdly happened to be dating one of like the premier choreographers of the Orange County dance teams, but like
Wow.
I didn't know that at the time. It was just sort of like a small world. But on the back of in the back of the room was a video playing of Willie dancing. I was like, what's that? And the guy's like, well, that's Balboa. And I'm like, I've seen Balboa, like at Memories and when Peter did, I was like, what's that? What's that? I want to see that. And the guy who was teaching had been dancing actually and practicing with Willie for about a year and a half at that point, and was like, you have a good eye. Let's talk.
By the way, for those of you listening at home who don't know about it, Willie Desitoff was one of the great original Bal Swing and Balboa dancers from Southern California back in the 30s and 40s.
And he has a really unique style too, which is
Very
exciting about
smooth, unique. Like his feet were doing these things, and like it was all these wiggly, waggly knees everywhere.
it.
But it just looks so smooth. And the follow, he was dancing. It was the 1982 dance party, and it was Marie that he was dancing with. And I was like, I love this. It just looks so effortless and simple, and that's what my body wants right now. And so I started working with this guy, like 4 days a week. And he was prepping me before I went to Willie and my first chance. So like I got to go to Bobby McGee's and I met Jack and Annie and I started working with Jack and I met Hal and Marge and I met everybody else that was at Bob McGee's. So Willie wasn't there. He hadn't been coming down to Orange County very much. So I was
Again,
getting prepped to go to the man kind of thing.
again, for those of you who don't know much about Balboa history, Bobby McGee's was this restaurant. It was, I always call it a Shoney on
Shoney's.
acid.
Yeah, it's a kitsch themed restaurant that was all over Southern California, Arizona, I believe. And like one half of it was a steakhouse, sort of a kitsch restaurant. Think like 1970s steakhouse. And then the other side was a sunken bar. And this was at all of their locations in general, some sort of a sunken general dance floor bar area. And they were split in half, so you could go in one side or the other, which was really neat. I really missed that place. It was great place to dance. And they had mirrors also. Sorry, I'm gonna deviate into that. Mirrors at the bottom of the floor. So like surrounding the dance floor at the like bottom, foot and a half, you could see everybody's feet. Which was a great learning tool as I was going, because I would sit there and like watch what, Marge or Annie was doing behind me while I'm trying to look at my feet. Like, is that the same thing?
Is that like you, some of the others who got to go to Bobby McGee's and kind of like grew up dancing and learning how to dance bow and bow swing and Southern Lindy, SoCal Lindy there. It sounds like you developed these superhero traits of like being able to like look in a mirror while you feel what's going on so that you can like put the two together. And so you're like switching in your brain the reverse image of what's going on. And like one of those superhero traits that comes with working with old timers.
It comes with working from old timers, but what people don't remember, and I figured this out early when I was working with Willie, is I have 18 years of gymnastics training before that, and with Olympic gymnastics coaches, where it was all about learning, like, not just where, you put your body, but like when to kick, when to power through things, like what inside of your body is doing to make some of these insane looking things happen, but they're really not that insane if you know the physics of it. And so like my mind was just to like watch this and make sense of the physics, and when they would change the feeling, it's like, oh, what internally are they changing to make the physics work and what I'm seeing? Okay. And like releasing my sense to that, rather than, I didn't have that sort of top down approach of like I learned it one way and then I had to deconstruct it. Like I was making sense of it all in the process. Yeah. And getting input from all of them. So like I was taking what everybody said and listening. I knew leaders at the time in the late 90s, early 2000s had their favorite leads that they've watched and they followed, and they upset like old original dancer leaders that they became they pick apart their movement, but they would get only obsessed about one of them, right? And like wouldn't like make sense of the big picture of what everybody was doing and how that sort of made a common thread.
Yeah, I remember like I came into Balboa in the early 2000s, so this is years after Shani's gotten into Balboa. But I remember very distinctly, and I came from Atlanta, so I didn't really connect. I didn't know much about Southern California and the dancing legacy that it had for those who lived in Southern California. But I do very distinctly remember that like those first few years of my classes, your teachers were either your male teachers or your leader teachers were either Willie Desitoff devotees or Maxie Dorf devotees, and those were like your two like
or Hal.
If you were right
like Steve
exactly
Garrett.
or Hal. So those were like you're going to get a Hal teacher or a Willie teacher or as far as the leaders went.
Yeah. So I was just looking at it from the sort of broader approach that when I finally did, which helped because I was dancing with them. Excuse me. It helped because I could figure out how to adjust for each person. And I was learning the skill of following, right? I've been used to like my body moving by itself for 18 years. And here I am like also in the entire process learning to that sort of waiting and sort of letting initiation happen and not being like the person that takes initiative all the time. Like that was a stretch setback for me as a person to like let myself sit back and not be in control of everything as a follow. So I was learning those simultaneously with all these people. That when I got to Willie, I already knew so much about how he trained differently than all the others did. But I also was coming with a much broader groundwork of knowledge. And I also had gymnastics training, and I was willing to submit to sort of the hard work of
willing to submit.
willing to submit
Oh!
to the cheese, Bobby.
That was really bad. I
Oh,
apologize to everyone.
I'm
Dad
here for
joke.
it.
Adorable.
Every pun, I'm here for it.
But yeah, so I was willing to sort of go the hard route and not just look for the easy answers, but to show that I was willing to do hard work to understand simple things. Made working with Willie, you know, much easier than my peers found it. Certainly the partner that brought me was really upset that I worked so quickly with him.
Well, you've mentioned these pieces so many times before, and I never put them together. That so Willie Desitov, for those of you listening, he identified very much with his Russian heritage, and he identified very much with the Russian aspect of training and the Russian like Willie himself had done gymnastics,
Ballet,
track
and field and basketball, yeah.
And so it makes so much sense that Shani, who's come from a heavy, probably Russian influenced gymnastic training background, is going to just like click right in there with the way that Willie kind of like saw training and the act of getting good at a skill. Is that an accurate way of saying it?
That's a very accurate way of saying it. My partner who brought me into the situation was there much more for an emotional sort of thing from Willie, and was not the kind of disciplined person. So Willie always had to harp on him constantly about like, just go stand in a corner and do the thing and just do it over and over again. And I'm like, okay, I'll go do it. So it was just a more and Willie just never had to ask twice of me to do that. Yeah. So yeah, it's really easy.
Well, sorry, Bobby.
You first.
Oh no, I was gonna say, I know that I've heard the story about you having to walk for a very long time before being allowed to do anything else, and this is kind of reflective of that kind of old school style of teaching. So I just wanted to ask about that little anecdote.
Yeah, so it's actually interesting that Willie was different than all the other original ballet dancers that we worked with, even trained with. And like he was thinking about things like down on lower levels, not about the move that you did or the move that you wanted to learn. Like he was thinking about like your basic movement, how you move through space in the world. And the main way we did that was walking. So he's like, you have to relearn how to walk, and walk in a way that's productive for dancing. And so he had actually built a ballroom basically in his garage, which was like an 8-car garage. It was just like giant floor downstairs, and he'd make me just do laps around it. And then my partner and I would go to school, and we have a school that was built in a circle, so I had to walk around school the way that Willie had taught me, and I would walk from my apartment, my dorm, to classes on campus, like walking the way Willie wanted to walk. But it did move that along a little faster because I guess my partner did walking for a few weeks longer than I did, like a month longer or more. So, but then it was like you did a basic for 6 weeks and that was it. And then I accidentally triple stepped. He's like, "Cool, all right, we're ready to move on." And it's like, okay.
Oh, you mean almost because because it came out naturally, or because you just
because it came out naturally. I'd been doing my basic for so long, and like I heard something, and I was like, "Oop, boop, boop," and he goes, "See, you just do it."
That's so cool.
The
like
student is ready.
Yeah, she's ready. Sorry, my last comment, and then Bobby, I want to hear your question. But it seems like there's this very organic way that he allowed your body to find these movements. And I feel like what's interesting about the swing dances is that they have ballroom pieces and heritage pieces, and you find the overlap of that in this experience where he is trusting the mechanics of your body, you're trusting the mechanics of your body to learn how to move. And then of course there's a shift if we know the history about how we've come to learn these different dances, but
so it wasn't a top-down approach. He wasn't like saying, you move your foot in this angle, this direction, that worked for my body. He'd be like, the point is that your weight should be here wherever you are, right? And my body is built very differently than these two very thin-framed men that were teaching me at the time. But it was about feeling where the physics of my body made the same thing happen that for their body. it's going to look slightly different, but it's going to come from many of the same mechanics on a very basic level, is the way he thought about it. But everybody else was literally being taught, like if you went to Hal's house, you got taught a move. Like it wasn't about how you made the move happen. You just like learned how to make the move happen no matter what. Like you weren't taught to make sense of it. You just like, you did the move with a few times with him. You say, no, move your foot here. No, partner comes around more here. He'd work on it like that. But it wasn't about like making sense of how and why we moved that way and why those choices were made in the first place. And Willie was all about understanding that.
Do you feel the other, how much did the old timers like, or to what extent were they conscious of your body and how it moved when you danced with them?
How much were they conscious of your body? That's an interesting question, because in some part of my mind, I want to say like they were 100% conscious of your body, like in the sense that like they were making sense of feeling where you were and where your weight was all the time. They did adjust themselves. A lot, about like 40% of them would ask you to come to them versus coming to you, if that makes sense. So they would feel where your body is and be like, okay, now where's mine? This is where it's supposed to be. But the way that you also frame that of like how conscious of they are of your body, I don't know, like in terms of my body shape or like who I am or what that was, I don't know how much they were conscious of those things. One of them definitely was conscious of my body. But the majority of them I don't think were conscious in those ways about like what my shape was like or how that might change things necessarily. Yeah.
Were they conscious there, or so how much did the old timers, do you think, thought about your identity as a Black woman, or that they were, you know, around a Black woman, or they were working with a Black woman?
It's interesting. Like some are very aware of it and some like but also in a way that like it was just, it might be mentioned in passing conversation and I'll explain that, but like it was never a thing. It was never like I was a different person there. It was something that was ever really talked about. Around this time, I often wore my hair in long pigtail braids, as my hair is rather long and sort of I have Native American style hair, so protective is just to braid it up and sort of whipping my partners around in the face with it. And so I would get little remarks maybe of like, little Cherokee princess on occasion. But other than that, like they knew that I was Black. They'd met my parents. My parents came once to Bobby McGee's. They met my dad. They'd seen that I was Black. It just wasn't a thing. Like half of them were Hispanics. Like one was Filipino. Like it just, I don't know. It wasn't something that they bothered about. Now, Hal was interesting though, because he was also starting to get Alzheimer's at this point. So he would forget that I wasn't Hispanic sometimes. And Marge would remind him. So like that was the only amount of conscientiousness that I would remember that Marge would remind him. She's not Hispanic. Remember how that's Shawnee. And like, so yeah. But other than that, it wasn't a conscientious thing with him.
Yeah.
But it was also interesting that the other follows who hung around then were Denise, who hung out with us every Sunday, who's Puerto Rican, and Tisei, who's Asian. So they were like, I don't know, just that's what they do. These kids.
Yeah. And just to explicitly state some things, because I know our audience members, some of them, like this is old news, they know this, but then some might be brand new. We're talking about people who, when was Hal born? When was
They're all ranging in births from 1920, I want to say 1917. Some of them as early as that to I think the latest ones are born in the late 30s, 40s. Some of the younger crowd dance there.
Yeah. And so their dancing heyday was in like the 1940s and 50s, right? And so we have lots of
30s, 40s, and 50s, yeah.
30s, 40s, and 50s, sorry. I was thinking about the ones who were born in 1930. Anyway, but so we're talking about this older generation of people, just to kind of like lay out the socio-cultural landscape, right? So we're talking about an older generation of people in the 1990s, right?
90s, 2000s, yeah.
1990s, 2000s.
They're all about 80 or 90 years old at this point. A few of them are in their 60s and 70s.
Yeah. And we have this beautiful biracial girl learning how to dance, right? Who's super talented. And everything that you've described is just kind of like this multicultural space, because you have people coming from all over these different places and influenced by different cultures set in SoCal and in Southern California. And so I feel like that picture, that landscape is not what I thought of when I thought about swing dancing. That picture didn't really come into my mind in full view until like the last 3 years. So
yeah,
Bobby,
for those of you for those of you who aren't, again, aware of the Southern California side of things, we in the modern era, if we think of, if we saw film footage of any of those 1940s movies, it's easy for us through our lens to see, oh, that's a room full of white teenagers, like standard white American teenagers. What we don't realize is that Southern California at the time, especially Los Angeles area, was a huge place for immigrants to go and find work. And so these, quote, white kids, unquote, a lot of them were first generation Americans whose parents had come over from European countries. And so you have,
or they themselves were not born here. Yeah.
And so you have Russian neighborhoods where Willie Desatov hangs out most of his time. And then you have Armenian neighborhoods and Turkish neighborhoods where Hal Takier lives. And so you have all these kids growing up, learning what it means to be American while also being very specific to their own European background cultures. And one of the interesting things is, even though there neighborhoods themselves were often either, immigrants tended to live with each other in their own communities, which makes total sense. There was also redlining, which does not make, total sense, but that is why most Black Americans lived in similar neighborhoods. And however, the schools were not segregated. And
entirely.
Right. And so there's this great picture of Willie Desatov's yearbook where Willie Desatov is standing there, and one kid over is a Black teenager, and then two kids back is a Japanese teenager, right? You have all these obvious and these teenagers are watching each other dance, and they're doing the dances at school, right? Just because they're not put in the movies
doesn't mean they all weren't part of the same social phenomena that was happening at their time, right? The same way that just because certain people ended up in the movies in the 90s and the commercials and the music videos, even now, doesn't mean there aren't a bunch of other people dancing. It's just that's how Hollywood tends to work.
Yeah. And to me, you're really special, Shani, in that, one, you're just Shani Brown. So by virtue of being Shani Brown, you're amazing. And in carrying this mantle and working with Willie and working with the original dancers, and you have this special knowledge that that's been really, I've benefited from it for sure. And I think Bobby had once framed this for me, and I loved it the way he framed it. He said, the people that the original dancers entrusted this dance to were you're talking about Denise and Tisay and you. Like, these are these women who represent like these multicultural perspectives, and so it just, I think it's a really special story. And
I mean, a lot of other people did get a chance to work with them, but there was a way that we spent time with them, not just learning, like, it wasn't just learning the dance. Like, we spent time with them, learning from them, hanging out. Like, Tisay would have dinner with them, even on nights when we weren't going out dancing. We would go up to Willie's once a week and hang out and meet up with Marge, go grocery shopping at Trader Joe's and get food. Like, they were family a little bit more than they were just somebody to learn from, because you wanted to learn from them, but you also wanted to like get context, the history. Like, we wanted to understand the stories, and you were going to get that more just hanging out with them and being a fly on the wall than you would like asking them at a lecture questions. So it was a very different sort of historical relationship too.
Yeah.
And
I was just going to throw out, Latasha talks about cultural surrogacy in a lot of her writing. And there's this idea of when you're passing down these cultural elements of relationship, right? And so when we talk about our current, like, so if I were to shift us to right now and think about 2020, moving into 2021, and the current racial climate right now, there are a lot of people asking questions like, how do we move forward? How do we move past these divides? And oftentimes it comes from what you did. It's recognizing not just what a person can give you, but their humanity and wanting to interact with them in relationship. And as you interact in relationship, then you learn these other pieces, not just like how to dance, but what their lives were like and what their
I
history
posit
was like.
something in here that just jogged something in my mind. Is this is one of the reasons why I had a hard time with the larger Lindy Hop community, particularly that is sort of centered around the Black Harlan Lindy Hopper experience, because it often felt like they weren't being serious. Like those people are people, and they aren't just people to get information from. Like they were people who had interesting stories, and yes, they love telling those stories, but like to get them, like to let them have their space to be humans and not just be put on this pedestal is something I didn't get to see happen over the last 20 years. And it always made me a little uncomfortable, especially because most of that audience was white. Not that it wasn't all, but it was typically white, and it just made me feel so strange because that wasn't that kind of relationship happening.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think that there are exceptions. Like there are people who
Yeah,
did form
those
deeper
relations.
relationships, but there's something to be said about um, how we kind of manage things in the US oftentimes, right? So we often will, this is the issue with cultural appropriation, right? And so we will often take on pieces of different cultures for our benefit. And when I say our, I would say that very loosely because technically I'm not even an American. So, but to be inclusive and to call in, right? This is a moment of calling in. Bobby and I talk about calling in versus calling out. But we do kind of have to ask ourselves, like, am I interacting with this person just to take from them, or do I recognize the full spectrum of their humanity as I'm engaging in swing dancing? Am I doing this and not caring about this person or their history or how we've come to be where we are, and I'm just taking this on to feel better about myself, and yay, this feels good? Or how did you do that thing in that movie, that was cool, versus like understanding the conditions under which they had to do those movies, right? And
Whether
so
that's the dancers, the musicians,
right,
the actors in movies, like it's all part of the same sort of understanding and how you relate to an artist and art that's out in the world, much less a person who's a part of a culture and
right,
what that
yeah,
means. So we're all part of culture, so we're all putting it out there. So to sit back and take a second to contextualize that for each person you meet is something that would be genuinely nice to do.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing, appreciate that.
And by the way, I did want to throw out there that you might get the impression just by listening to what we've talked about so far that the original Southern California dancers were, you know, benign, non-racist people. Of course, they grew up in their time, in their place, and so a lot of them did have, beliefs that were racist. It just they, I think, how much of that in Shani, when you met them from the beginning, or maybe when like Denise first ran into them, which I know was a few years earlier than most of the modern dancers. How much was there a change that you felt over the time that you got to know them, or by the time that you had met them, were they actually, how racist were they at the beginning of the time that you met them versus at the end, or was that not even something that you felt?
That wasn't I definitely felt that there were moments that they had what I would call their generational biases, right? It wasn't like outright racism. Like, strangely, I think their children's generation be a little bit more outright racist than most of them were, particularly because the majority of these people were first generation immigrants. So, like, there's a sense of like difference already with many of them. But Marge's generation, actually, even because she's about 20 years younger than Hal, and she's an American coming from the Midwest, came from a very different place. And she would talk about that she herself didn't feel these ways. But she knew a lot of people that did. have those racist attitudes, and she would talk about how she grew up in that environment. So like those things were in the back of her mind sometimes, but her and I spent a lot of time together. That was never a problem. And not only that, I knew when she would tell me stories about, she followed around the black saxophone musicians because they were the best musicians, and she was just loved the way that they sounded, and would go to sort of all the clubs that you're not supposed to go to in LA when you're a white girl coming from the Midwest. So she came from that environment, but many of the others did not, or didn't display it, and certainly would never have been rude enough to have said something to your face or in your presence, if they did, that I even know of. But I don't know many of them to have that attitude.
Yeah, I think that some of our white male friend instructors who had talked to some of the old timers heard a few racist jokes thrown in.
Yeah.
So I do know that is a fact.
Yeah. I mean, jokes might, again, that's a kind of one of those things that I feel like is, it might be dropped on a generational thing, and they're not doing it to be mean, and they wouldn't necessarily like refuse, business from that person, or like they're never like that. It's like the soft racism versus hard racism, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's a California thing. That's a very sort of different experience with racism in the entire area, though.
Yeah, I think that this brings up the notion of like racist behaviors versus like racism in general, right? And so like we recognizing that I think of the quote like racism is like the water that we swim in, it's everywhere, right? So it's with it impacts all of us. I mean, even as a Black woman, like I have some internalized racism. I've got some things that I have to deconstruct. My sense of value, my understanding of how the world works comes from like what I've been told by, and so it's what's really unique about this group of people is I think it's really I think it's easy for us to rid ourselves of nuance when we think about these ideas. And so I appreciate your distinction between like the generational bias, like things that were considered to be okay at that time versus things that were considered to be okay later on, and kind of like outright racist behaviors, right? So in the 50s and 60s, like there were some outright racist behaviors that came from a lot of these people's children, right? And that's
or even themselves, possibly,
and even themselves. And we see the culmination. Like, it's not to say that these things didn't exist before the 50s and 60s, because it certainly did, but we saw the civil rights movement responding to this, like to the outright racist behaviors and laws and all of that. But racism, as we understand it, has existed all around us for
and changes continually. Gender is actually a good way to explain it with this generation. So like I definitely did see them change in how they dealt with gender norms over the years. I saw them go from a generation that had a hard time with divorce to most of them being divorced and learning to accept that, and then they learned to accept different families that weren't normative. Maybe they learning to accept their gay family members, people in our dance community who are differently gendered, learning to accept women who didn't get married but had children, and not only accept it, but supported it. Like I saw that change in them, but it was very clear that just like with how racist behaviors happen, that those things change. Like they don't keep many of those racist behaviors. Those racist behaviors might still be there, but like they start to shed some of them as the community changes around them. And the same thing with gender norms. They responded, there might be some resistance, some funny jokes at first, but like over time they start to say lead and follow, and they made their own changes too. So I had to leave them that space, because I couldn't, like, the minute they did that, I couldn't just be like, oh, write you off, like, you're done. But like, you're a product of your generation. I can't blame you for that, but I do want you to try. And if they did, they were great people, and they did. So.
Hey everybody, this is Bobby White from Integrated Rhythm. We're here to ask you to please consider donating to the podcast. You can do so by going to patreon.com/integratedrhythm. You can do so by Venmoing @BobbySwungover. And make sure to put a little IR in the note so we make sure it goes to the right people. You can also do so by PayPaling at Bobby White 3, and once again putting a little IR in the window there. Doing so will help us keep this podcast going, and we love doing it, and we hope you love it too. If you can't afford to donate at this time because times are rough, we totally understand. We don't want you to put yourselves out. We want you to keep enjoying the podcast for free. However, if you have a little bit of pocket change in your pocket, we would greatly, greatly, greatly appreciate it. Thanks and have a great day. Shani, so some people who meet you might not realize that you're a Black woman. Do people in the swing dance, first off, have you encountered that in the swing dance scene where you're around people who don't realize that? And if so, what are some kind of the experiences that you've had in those instances?
So for those who can't see or who are listening, I happen to be not your typical light-skinned Black person. I don't have that sort of very light, we come in such a range of colors, but I don't have this sort of very light creamy color tone to my skin. I have a very sort of brownish, caramely, darker, Native American-y looking skin color. And then I have straight hair. I don't know. Genes are weird, right? Like, there's no telling. My dad has, an afro when I was a kid, and my mom is white. It's just a thing that happens, and some kids come out with mixed with curly hair, some kids don't. And that confuses a lot of people. Because I've grown up in an all Black family. I've grown up living with my Black family on weekends. Like I have Black family experiences. Like culture is part of my life. It's who I am. And in the dance community, the way that interaction happens is different than on the outside world. So it's rather interesting. So most of the time people don't know, and it's not from comments where like they're making a racist joke that they may not be, realizing that there's a person of color in the room or a Black person in the room. Right? You might tell the joke about Black people if there's a Hispanic in the room, but you're not afraid about it because there's not a Black person in the room. Like it hasn't been those kinds of experiences. It's typically been experiences when the majority of non-colored people in our community are struggling with learning about or discussing racism, people of color in the community, when they're talking about it amongst themselves, whether that's been after a lecture about an event, or when that's been about my reaction to something in a room that they didn't realize, like, why would you react that way? Well, it's because I'm a Black person and this is awkward. And you're Black? Like, that's sort of the reaction, the typical reaction that I get. Or they're struggling with something and I say, well, this is why Black people feel that way, and this is why it's important to maybe, consider these things. And they're like, but how would you, like, you're just a person of color. I'm like, yes, but I'm Black. I understand not only from a personal perspective, but an academic perspective. I've studied these things as like I said, I was a gender science major. And yeah, so the interactions are more like on a positive side. At least these people are doing some work. They're being introspective, but they don't realize that there's somebody standing right next to them that they could talk to about these things, or that they can look to, or that they can, maybe think more clearly about what they're saying and not be so like just letting the words run out of their mouth, but actually be conscious of what they're thinking in this process. Yeah, it's been really interesting. It's not the like accidental racist comment, which is what happens in the outside world when people don't realize that I'm Black. At the Lindy Hop community.
Well, and so as a world traveling instructor, have your experiences been different in different places?
Here's one of the places where I think colorism in the Black community is a thing, because I can get away with being in many places or having many experiences because people don't treat me or see me as a Black person. So they see somebody who would be darker skinned or more phenotypically presenting as African American as somebody that they might be a bit more reserved around, as somebody that they might have to be more conscious about what they say or do, but they don't feel that way around me. So people just often open themselves up a bit more. And it has that weird way of like, I blend in many spaces. Like I can blend in at a cookout, and then I can blend in weirdly at some like random hotel in Sweden and hang out with people. Like I don't really know how it works, but it's enough that like I feel different, but not different enough from people that they feel comfortable for me. And that's a thing about not being a darker skinned Black woman, that my experiences are very different.
Yeah, there's like this double-edged sword to that, like a double-sided experience where you might have more doors open up to you in some respects, but then there's this other side of invisibility as well, where there's kind of like erasure of aspects of you also.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about even on the Lindy Hop scene or going just to the Balboa scene alone, people, it's becoming more of a thing as we've been doing lectures about it lately that people recognize it. But when you talk about people of color in the scene, people will skip right over me. Even being like one of the named teachers on most of their events, they'll skip right over me being one of those people. Yeah, so I'm often invisible in that space. But invisibility, like you said, invisibility has its benefits sometimes. Being that fly on the wall and also being able to really hear the conversations of non-people of color are having, even when they're struggling in a good way with some of these concepts. It's sometimes good to not hear them censored so that you can really help them figure out what they're feeling and thinking as well.
Yeah, it's that makes me think of it's important for people to be honest, and oftentimes like when they have this visual cue of like, I shouldn't actually say the thing I'm actually thinking or feeling because I might be considered a racist or I might be considered to be wrong. That actually doesn't help us moving forward. Like Robin DiAngelo and other writers talk about how I actually believe that W.E.B. Du Bois said this first. So I'm not going to attribute something to, anyway, it's fine. That's a different conversation altogether. But the idea that the people who are like probably the biggest hindrances to progress are white progressives, like, because there's this sense in which like we already know, we got this is obvious, and it's like it's actually not obvious in here. It's not obvious internally, and we need to deconstruct like that thing.
And we got this because they say we got this because they feel they never share that full internal thing that they need to actually grapple with and wrestle with, because they're afraid that if of being wrong or misstepping or whatever who they're around, they never fully get that out, so they never extricate the deeper stuff.
Yeah, I'm totally guilty as charged in that. They're like the whole you clamp up out of fear of not offending someone, and that just clamps up your entire the things that you need to think about, or the aspects of your personality that come out that you have to like examine.
Get a little deeper too.
Yeah, we're all on this imperfect journey, and so it's an imperfect journey.
Imperfect journey.
We said that.
I pushed it a little too hard. I was going imperfect journey. I chose too low. Chisomo, do you mind just telling everyone a little bit about what meeting Shani for the first time meant to you, or hearing about Shani meant to you?
Yeah. So you were talking about invisibility, and I experienced your invisibility because I stepped into the swing dance scene truly for the first time in 2008, but then I wasn't really a part of it because of like life, and then I traveled I lived in Zambia for a number of years. So I actually, like, my real kind of like sustainable entry into the scene was probably around 2014, 2015. And I was kind of like, I can't see myself in this dance. And I decided to study Balboa. And I was like, how? I don't make any sense at all. And as most of you all have heard, if you listen to episode 3, Stephanie Schilling is a very good friend of mine, and she and I have trained together. And so Stephanie is this beautiful biracial woman who has long legs. And anyway, so she also could see herself in the scene. Yeah, I mean, if you see her, you'll be like, why did you reduce her to her legs? And you'll see her and you'll be like, oh, because she actually has really long legs. It's so funny. Oh my gosh, Stephanie, I'm so sorry. You know I love you. Anyway, so she is so many things. Just listen to episode 3 and you'll hear all the wonderful things. But she couldn't see herself on the scene either. And our dance teacher at the time, Valerie Sahlstrom, was like, no, but Stephanie, there is somebody who looks like you. Her name's Shani. There's a Black woman. And we were like, what? We were like,
tables fly in the air.
There's a Black lady in the swing dance in the
That's funny because I remember the day I saw Stephanie and I was like, look, there's another person like me. Oh!
Yeah,
I saw her before she saw me.
Yeah. And so, yeah, we literally, exactly, you saw her from a distance and then we heard about you and we were like, what is going on? And so then I think there's probably like a 6-month period of us trying to figure out how to get together. But it was such an amazing moment, but then also a frustrating moment because we were like, you're telling me that we've been up in this place for like 3 years and you haven't said, nobody has said nothing to us about this Black lady in the scene. And so then we meet you, Shani, at I met you at Calval.
Calval, yeah. It's when I met you.
2017. So we just had like our 3-year no-anniversary. We met each other, and we had a private lesson, and it was one of the first times that I felt understood in how my body moves, and it was such within the Balboa scene, I should say, and it was such an impactful moment that I was brought to tears. I was sobbing, not just crying.
All three of us.
Was like some, it was like ugly crying. Yes. So yes, Shani, Stephanie, and I are all ugly crying, and our friend David, this beautiful man who
I forgot David was there.
So it was David.
Plotkin
David
standing there awkwardly.
Yes, he was just like standing there watching these 3 Black women just sob. Like we found each other and it makes sense.
That's cool, guys. I'm just gonna grab some water really quick.
Exactly. I'll just be over here, but we're like, no, come here. And
taste our tears, David.
Exactly, wipe our tears. It was ridiculous. I think Stephanie had buried her face into David. I had buried my face into you. And then like we were just like having this moment because when you are rendered invisible, when you are not considered in your educational process, when you when what you've been told doesn't make sense to you and you're not present because you've been systematically shut out. When you find somebody who's had a similar experience, who can invite you into your educational process, who understands aspects of you that you don't have to explicitly explain, that moment is magical. And so that was what it was like for me to meet Shani for the first time.
It was, everybody felt seen in that moment. It was like, I felt seen as an instructor, as somebody who's been like harping on making sense and dancing for your own body. I felt seen as seeing other people with me, like me, in my dance community, and they felt seen, and we just all lost it. I mean, it felt good to be seen. It's a weird feeling. I was very invisible in this community for a long time, not because I wasn't good, and part of that was my own making, but it feels good to be seen and recognized.
Yeah.
That make me cry again.